there, everyone. I'm Dr. Jennifer Bird. I'm a biblical scholar. This is story time. And as you know, I care about what people do with what they find in the Bible. That is my main thing. I like to talk about that here. Sometimes I do that by myself, and I call it story time because we're reading passages from the Bible. Sometimes I call it story time because I bring on a colleague or a friend, primarily doing scholars right now, to talk about why they do what they do with the Bible. So it's been a very fun thing for me to get to do. And today I feel very honored that we have Dr. Rhiannon Graybill, who is joining us today. She's just a badass, really. She's currently a professor of religious studies at University of Richmond in Virginia, here in my home state. She currently is in the chair, the Marcus M. and Carole M. Weinstein and Gilbert M. and Fannie S. Rosenthal Chair of Jewish Studies. Very impressive for so early in her career, by the way, I should say. So because she didn't finish her PhD, she finished PhD in 2012. So that's just very impressive. So a BA in religion from Swarthmore College, an MA, and a PhD from University of California, Berkeley, and both in Near Eastern Studies, the PhD with an added designated emphasis in critical theory. And that's a thing that she and I share. I didn't have a focus the way she did, but the love of bringing critical theory to reading biblical texts is what I admire so much in her work. So let's see, I did not put the website. I think I put her website, the faculty website in the chat. Let me go ahead and put that in there. And there's also, let's see, what else did I want to share with you just to look her up? I'm actually going to share in case you all want to go look it up. When I ask people what their early influences are, I'm usually asking for like the reading and things like that, but she also shared the website with an article about her mother, who is retired, but was a bishop in the ELCA church. And I was fangirling a little bit as I read about her. So I thought I would share the website with you all if you want to go check her out, check out what she's, Rhiannon's mother. And Jessica Christ. So anyway, so we have, and on her website, you can, on the faculty page at University of Richmond, you can see the books that Rhiannon has written herself, that she's also worked with others to edit. And so her texts, the ones that I'm familiar with, Are We Not Men? Unstable Masculinity in the Hebrew Prophets. So, talking about gender, much more complex way, perhaps. What I'm excited to hear more about, because I haven't had a chance to read it yet, is her book Texts After Terror. So I don't know if I don't know how many of you all would have read or heard of. I think I've mentioned it a few times. There's a book called Texts of Terror by Phyllis Tribble. I had to pause because all of a sudden, is it Phil Spurd? Phil Stribble? Phil Stribble. That was kind of a benchmark in terms of taking feminist critique to biblical texts, and it's very literary. It's very literary, lots of rhetorical engagements and criticisms. But she essentially just focused in on a bunch of stories that have to do with women that didn't get a lot of attention. And so 40 years later, Rhiannon did something starting with that framework, but then also adding this whole other layer. So let me go ahead and bring her on so you all can see who I'm talking about. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so great to be here. And oh my God, so many people in the chat already. I'm intimidated.
Oh,
but everyone's being super nice.
Everybody, yes, it's love. People are here with love, right? Yeah, I meant to warn you that I might pay attention a little bit to the chat, but I'm mostly interested in just having a conversation with you for them to enjoy. So, yes, thank you everyone who's here. Thanks for who wanted to be here and able to be here in the chat, and for welcoming Dr. Graybill. So Rhiannon, You are a scholar. You are very well educated. You bring a lot of stuff to the table. So would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself? What parts of you, um, what parts of your past, your life, your childhood, whatever parts of your life that you're comfortable talking about would help us understand you, and then thus the kinds of things that you've decided to take on in your scholarship?
Yeah, absolutely. So you let the cat out of the bag a little bit, talking about my mom. So I'm from Montana, and I grew up in Montana, and my mom was a Lutheran pastor there, and she eventually became the bishop when I was in grad school. I think a lot of people who work on religion and sexuality, or religion and gender, many people in our field have a traumatic past where the Bible was instrumentalized against them or used as a weapon, or they were sent to some like horrific anti-gay Bible camp or something. So like I'm in the field and I did not have that. I had the opposite, lovely. I wish more people had my experience of having this really strong feminist mother who was also a clergy person. And so like I thought feminist biblical interpretation was just like the regular kind, which was actually kind of traumatic when I got to grad school. I was like, oh, of course, like this is great.
Right.
So my mom was, she went to Harvard Divinity School. She was like very like cutting edge scholar. And then, you know, she was out on the prairie being a clergy person. So she was a huge influence on me and really helped me. And she also, both my parents really made me love literature. So I went to college back east in Philadelphia. I went to Swarthmore. Okay, it's not in Philly, it's in the suburbs, but we can pretend. So I went to college and I thought I wanted to study literature. And so I wanted to do English or maybe history. And then I took a class with Rachel Haverlock, who's also just an amazing person she's kind of left our field a little bit, but she's brilliant. She's smart.
She's doing, you can't hear me. Can you hear me?
No. I can hear you.
Oh, you can?
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Okay. She's doing eco stuff now, right?
Yeah, she's kind of moved into some like river stuff, but she was finishing her PhD and she was a leave replacement for Nathaniel Deutsch, who's also an amazing scholar. And I was this like terrified freshman. I didn't want to talk in class because I thought I was a geographic diversity admit. So like I was film and they just needed like all the 50 states, you know? But she was such a good teacher, and she, you know, called me into her office and like gave me this pep talk. And she was also a feminist biblical scholar. And I was like, this is great. I want to be like Rachel. Nice. And so like I just had these wonderful teachers. And then I decided to go to grad school and I went to Berkeley. And Berkeley's like pretty at the end, like pretty cutting edge in literary stuff and theory stuff. That's why I went there. I had a pretty mixed grad school experience. I think grad school is traumatic for a lot of us. I had some issues while I was there, which also led me to think about sexual violence and reporting and things like that.
Okay. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, but I had a good cohort of friends and colleagues. And I've been really grateful since then. All of the people like you, Jennifer, but other people too, like whose work I've admired, who I've met in the field. And so like biblical studies is not like it's just a weird, unwieldy field, but I feel like there are some really lovely places in the field. And I've been really lucky to be able to find people and connect with them. And so I feel like it turned out in a really lucky way. My mom thought it was hilarious that I became a biblical scholar, you know, because like you're supposed to have your Oedipal revolt or whatever. But my dad's a lawyer. My brother's a lawyer. My grandfather was a lawyer. Great grandfather was. So like, this is my revolt. Wow. I'm not a lawyer.
You're not a lawyer. Okay.
Which I'm sure there are plenty of us.
Right.
But that's sort of how I got here. And then I was at Berkeley, and then my now husband is a Germanist. So we were in Berlin for a year. Oh, and then we moved from Berlin is amazing. We moved from Berlin to Memphis, which is like not a common move, but taught at Rose College for
very challenging one, right?
12 years. And then, now I'm at Richmond. That's just finishing my first year. Yeah, I never really lived in the South, and Memphis is really Southern, but it was great. Like I loved Rose has lovely people, and the students there were great. So
yeah, I was gonna say, I think I applied for a position there and was really hopeful, but it just seems like a great place. Yeah. So this is just your first year at Richmond, is that?
Yeah.
Okay, because I didn't realize it, and then when I looked you up, I thought, oh, how did I not know she's?
How did
she
get there? Yeah,
and it's recent. Okay.
So yes, you haven't missed a lot. I just moved this year.
Okay. I'm sorry. Sometimes I get distracted by the comments. I didn't realize Germanology was a field. You know, the language, the labels. You know, German is a terminology of you?
Oh, very Southern is great. It's just I was a Montanan, and so I was like used to like sub-zero temperatures, and then I went to Memphis, and like I was not prepared for the weather. But then I grew to love it, and now I can't go back to Montana. That my family ridiculing me for how cold I get.
That's so sad. Yeah, because the humidity and all the things about Memphis, right? They're just
but
so
it's
different.
such an amazing city.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Haven't spent much time there myself, but so. It is fun. This is one of I do actually enjoy getting to hear these parts of our colleagues, lives, like, oh, I didn't know that, didn't know these things. So, and knowing about your mother and how your experience was actually very different from mine. And as you said, it is kind of fun to hear that and to think about that. And then to think about, well, but the work that you have done, has been incredibly critical, like critically thinking, critical theory, critical of the texts. So, I'm just kind of reflecting on that you had a positive-ish, I guess, take on what the Bible is. And then you end up doing this. So let's talk a little bit then. Let me bring in some of the influences that you mentioned, some of your early, we'll put some, let's see, let's start with, I don't know which one to start with. Let's start with the manifesto. So for folks who maybe are on a smaller screen, this is a compilation. So it's Donna Haraway. Haraway, yeah. So the Cyborg Manifesto is included in this. What would you like us to know that helps us to know how you think? And what is it about the Cyborg Manifesto that resonated for you?
Yeah, so this is something I had never heard of. And I went to college and I had this really cool roommate, and we were taking all of these different like literary classes, and we both kept having to read this in different classes. And at first we thought it was just wild and it made no sense. But also what I love about it, it's this idea. So Donna Haraway is a biologist who then sort of moves into feminist theory. And the idea that she has is that we need to make new myths. And so what this text is doing is called a manifesto for cyborgs, or sometimes it's just the Cyborg Manifesto. Okay. So she's like, we need a new myth. The old myths we have are not useful. I'm going to make an ironic myth that's faithful, but also ironic. And so she just makes up, it's this wild, it's like about Reagan in the 80s and the arms race and cyborgs and thinking and the Garden of Eden. And it's throwing all kinds of things at you. And so the experience of reading it is really disorienting, but also exhilarating, right? Because it's a manifesto and you're like, I don't know, but I like it, but it's strange. And so I think I often respond sort of emotionally or affectively. And then I sort of get into the ideas too. But I think this is just a beautiful work of sort of thinking about how you can do scholarship, but it's not just sort of like straightforwardly like, first I'll do this, then I'll do this. Here's a roadmap. Like it's this weird, disorienting, creative piece that then becomes really influential in a lot of feminist theory, but it's also just really fun and it's really strange. And some people also really don't like it, which makes it really fun to talk about because it inspires strong feelings in readers. And so I just love it. And I find myself going back to it. I mean, I've also Haraway spoke at our conference at AAR SBL once, and she was such a generous speaker, which is something also the academy can be kind of nasty sometimes. And she is very much the kind of person who would give credit to her graduate students or talk about her conversation partners. And it's kind of this playful and building and companionship. I love the vibe it has.
That's nice. Yeah, right. We need more of that in academia or in the fields that religious studies, biblical studies. Nice. When what year was that? Do you remember? I
think it was when I was in California. It was one of the California years.
I'm
not sure when, but I was like, oh, they're so great.
Yeah, the aughts, the early teens, something like that. Okay, so Donna Haraway, the Cyborg Manifesto, whichever. Yeah, and in particular as an educator, right? When you have something that gets strong emotions out of people, whatever it is, or strong reactions, that just makes for fun conversation. That makes for fruitful kinds of exchanges, right? Let's go see. And so is there an element of that specifically that you bring into your own scholarship? Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
is there a like all over the place kind of thing that you do also? Or
So one thing I do in my book about sexual violence, in Text After Terror, I talk about resisting the idea that anyone can approach the text from a position of innocence. So we're all already implicating from positions. We're all inhabiting certain kinds of bodies. We all have histories with the text. And so this is something that Haraway talks about there in a kind of playful way. In that book you were showing, it's Simian, Cyborgs, and Women is the name of the book. There's another chapter called Situated Knowledges, which is a kind of like classic feminist sort of statement of just this idea that, you know, everybody's positional. There's no like God's eye view from which you can take a neutral ethical stance. And I think that's really important for thinking about. So I use it in my book for talking about thinking about sexual violence, thinking about text. There's sort of often this desire, I find, have people be like, well, who's the good guy in the story? Like, what's the innocent position? You know, like maybe like Leah's the victim and Rachel is bad, or Lot's bad, or like there's this, we want to blame people and then we want some really good people. And I want to make an ethical case for resisting claiming that position of innocence as a kind of starting point.
Yes. Okay. If I repeat what you're saying, it's not because there is something really powerful and helpful in what you're saying, that raising the point for people, right? Trying to get people to see that none of us are innocent readers. Is that the wording you used? And we all have a story or a connection to the stories. And I mean, I think that's just a really important angle, a really important element to bring to people's attention. So that's really fun. That's fun to hear about. I am. Which one should we look at next? Which one should we talk about?
Maybe like the horror. Maybe Clover. Okay. Let's do Clover.
Okay, let's do Clover. All right. Oops. Let's do. I have to be honest. I haven't read any of the books that you shared, actually.
Oh, and I gave you the weirdest list.
I like it though. I like it. I'm like, oh, I feel, and I actually was like, oh, I'm not educated, well-rounded enough, because I didn't even ever read like the genealogy of morals or whatever. I feel like I need to do some of this reading. Add it to my reading list. Anyway, so we have, her name is very hard to read.
Carole. Oh, it's Carole Clover. I can't even see it on there.
Yeah, Men, Women, and Chainsaws: Gender in the Modern Horror Film. Talk to us. What is it about this that you like? What is it that's
This is another one where it's written in a really compelling, beautiful, interesting way. So this book, Carole Clover, she was a Scandinavianist. So she studied Scandinavian, I think like Scandinavian folklore. And the story is that somebody dared her to watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And then she did, and she got really interested in kind of like the formal patterns of horror films. So it's this really interesting analysis of how gender is performed in horror movies. And she makes this interesting argument that lowbrow, trashy, bad horror films are actually doing a more interesting and sophisticated thing with gender than a lot of like highbrow. So something like Scream is doing more than something like a Hitchcock film. And so she's got this really interesting kind of analysis of gender. So she talks about slasher films, and she talks about possession films, and how there's always like a female, like the female body is always the body that's possessed. And it's usually about men having their transformation. Yeah. And then you start to read it and you're like, yes, I see the pattern.
Yeah.
And so it's just such a fun read, and it's so compelling, and it teaches really well. And it's also just such an interesting kind of like way of thinking about gender dynamics. And it's obviously not about the Bible at all, but I found it useful in kind of thinking about how I think about some different biblical stories.
Right. Yeah. No, these don't have to be about biblical texts to be very, of interest to me for this. And also just, right. All the things you just said about just having someone highlight the pattern for you can be helpful. And that's, again, what you're trying to do in other ways. So I'm not a big fan of horror, though. I don't.
Yeah, I'm pretty squeamish, but I love the theory. So I have to read the theory, and then I can like read this IMDb page, and then I can watch the movie.
Okay.
But they do an interesting thing with gender. And I'm also interested in how sort of like non-academic genres can help us think about the Bible in different ways. Mm-hmm. And so like, there are a lot of people doing monster work in our field now, doing some horror. I think a lot of the horror work is sort of masculinist. And so I'm also interested. Do you know Kelly Murphy? Like, we're doing a feminist horror project together. We're like in early stages.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
yeah. Okay. Yeah, a lot of the horror is masculinist, isn't it?
Which is kind of like the Bible,
It's just kind of like so many fields, right? What is the one that you said that Clover is saying that some of the lowbrow stuff those movies are doing something interesting, a little bit more interesting with gender? Can you say a little bit more about what, like, are they challenge? Like, what does she say they're doing?
So like she talks about how one of the patterns she talks about is the protagonist, and it's funny because she writes this book and then Wes Craven reads the book and then he like incorporates it into like now horror movies. You know the scene in Scream where he's like, these are the rules of horror. Basically, like there's such a self-referentiality in horror that then like the book itself becomes incorporated. So like The Final Girl, for example, is something that now we know about because there's like a show called The Final Girl.
Interesting.
So the final girl is the girl that survives in a slasher, and usually she has brown hair, she has an androgynous name, she doesn't have sex, she kills the killer with a phallic weapon in a uterine space, and like now this is a pattern.
For real?
Yeah. And so like Clover identifies this pattern. So like I use this to read the story of Jael, who also has an gender ambiguous name.
Right.
She kills the killer with a phallic weapon in a uterine space. There's this kind of way that she is. And this is also, I mean, this book is written before trans theory kind of emerges the way it does. So she talks about how the character is female, but then is also a point of masculine identification. So like think about all the teenage boys rooting for, like Lori or somebody and like rooting for the heroine. And so she kind of gets into the gender dynamics of that. And I think also this is interesting when we think about some biblical stories, like the story of Jael or the story of Judith, like these killer women in the Bible and the kind of dynamics of identification. But yeah, it's also just a fun way, like the book is a fun way of thinking about patterns. So she also, like I brought up, she talks about, women are possessed so that men can work through their issues. Like think about The Exorcist. It's like Reagan is the girl, and she has this dramatic possession, and then it's all about the priest. And so I talk about that like together with Hosea and the way that Gomer's body is tortured. Gomer is the woman in Hosea who gets really dramatically tortured just to kind of work through this masculine issue. So I found it an interesting book to think with. It's also just fun to read.
Okay. Awesome.
So that's my pitch for Clover.
Thank you for that. She should be paying you for the endorsements here. Just kidding. So can we talk about genealogy of morals?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay. I heard a Radiolab. There's a Radiolab episode that I just loved, where they talk about morality. Like we can see morality in like wolf packs, things like that. Like you don't need a God figure. It's kind of in our DNA, and I keep waiting to do something with that sometime on Storytime or something. I don't know, but anyway, so I haven't read Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals. What can you tell us about it?
So
why is it important for you?
I mean, Nietzsche's a controversial pick, but I think I want to make a pitch for reading Nietzsche because he's weird and funny and mean and like totally doing this thing that's not at all working at his time that works later. In some ways, he's sort of like in many ways, he is doing this foundational work. So you don't get somebody like Donna Haraway without having Nietzsche as a foundational step. You don't get somebody like Judith Butler and Gender Trouble. So he's like the deep scaffolding for a lot of that. I mean, the kind of basic thing he's saying is that morality is not universal. It's something that there are different ways of telling the story of morality, right? And so he gives us a couple different possibilities. This sort of feels like, I can kind of see that to us, but like he does such an interesting job of laying it out. But like the real pitch I want to make for Nietzsche is this is the book that taught me how to read slowly, because I took several different classes where we would read it, and like you read it and you kind of get it and you don't, and it's weird and offensive and elusive. And I have this copy from college that has all these different colors of notes in it from different kinds of classes. And I think this is something you could do with any number of difficult books, but that practice of reading slowly and rereading and reading it out loud and talking about, I mean, it's a very much like how I like to read the biblical text too. I mean, it's like a scriptural way of reading. You read a couple lines of Genesis and you talk about it. But I think that this book also really lends itself to that. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons it's important to me. It's just sort of like my own history as a scholar, sort of learning how to think and how to read. Yeah. I'm a jumpy thinker. I skip around. I like to do things fast and messy, and like being forced to slow down is really good for me. Okay. And so I mean, I'm probably the only person to be like, Robert Alter and Friedrich Nietzsche together taught me this, but it's like those practices of reading.
Robert Alter, by the way, for those who don't know, is a biblical scholar, and who talks about what's his main
Yeah,
thing?
the art of biblical narrative.
right.
He basically says that the Bible is like an artfully written literary text, and he's just really good at reading the Bible. And then he translated the whole thing.
Yes, I heard about that. Yeah.
Yeah, he's just a beautiful reader.
It's a massive
And
undertaking.
he taught me. He was my doctoral advisor too. He taught me also to read slowly. He was, yeah.
Oh my goodness! What a
I know.
what
I
a
should have
treat.
given his book. I'm a terrible student, but no, he was lovely.
no,
smart.
No.
Beautiful reader.
Lovely. Thank you. Actually, I enjoy what you just said about both Robert Alter and Nietzsche and why it's important. I really, really would love for people to read more slowly in general, right? There's a lot of stuff out there that just needs to be processed a little bit more than people often give it. But also going back to some of these foundational texts and giving them a hearing, right? It's important. Okay, we have another book to discuss, and this is is it Luce Irigere? Which way do you pronounce it?
I would say loose, but I am not sure.
I know. I like to say Luce.
Call it Irigere. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, let's do that. But I'm like, I'm sure that's not right, but it seems right to me. So
she's Belgian.
What's that?
I think she's from Belgium.
Yes. See, so I don't. Yeah. Which way do you do that? I don't know. I am going to say it's also just kind of sad. The covers are very, very plain. They definitely stick out to you, but it's not as fun to look at right now as the others have been, is I guess what I'm trying to say. So Speculum of the Other Woman. I think I did read parts of this. I don't think I read the whole thing. So yeah, this is, and I'm more, as we were discussing earlier, I'm more familiar with this Sex, which is not one, which was very important for me in my dissertation, my doctoral work. So talk to us about this, please. What is it? What connected?
Yeah, so this is a classic. We call it French feminism, even though they're mostly not French, right? And so it's like they write in French. It's Lucy Gray, Hélène Cixous, and Julia Kristeva. And so it's this sort of beautiful, aggressive, in some ways somewhat essentialist, but I think that people are doing interesting non-essentialist things with Irigaray, like really playful with language, feminist take on psychoanalysis. And so and it's just bonkers in a way that I find fascinating. So Speculum of the Other Woman is partly a critique of Plato and the Allegory of a Cave, this like feminist rereading of Plato. And it's partly a feminist rereading of Freud. So it's like, those are the two bookends, giant chapters.
Cool.
In the middle are these 10 little essays. It's brilliant. It's so aggressive. I mean, we were talking about Irigaray before. I'm sorry, about Nietzsche before. Irigaray has a book about Nietzsche where she's basically like, what if Nietzsche had a lover and that lover were the ocean? And that will be the book that I will write, like from the perspective of, it's called Marine Lover of Friedrich Nietzsche. So like, she's wild. And it really made me think about like, what can you do as a scholar? I have never written something that exciting, but like it really kind of, I was fascinated. And I really didn't like it when I started reading it because it's not the kind of book where you can like outline, the arguments in the book. But I found also that experience of reading. And then also I was in a study group and I was trying to explain it to the group and they just kept not getting it. And that made me love it and made me frustrated that they didn't get it. And so it was
right.
Like, these are all sort of books I've wrestled with in interesting ways.
Okay.
And she's a challenge to read, but she's beautiful. And I think, yeah, it's just, I love her.
Underappreciated, I think.
Tricky. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, good. Thank you for that. I want to talk about your work now. We have, I'm going to share I know you have multiple books, but this is the one I'm so excited to talk about. So I'm just going to do that. It's a really cool cover.
Thank you. I came up with the idea and I was excited that they went for it.
Nice. And like, did you suggest the specific statue?
Yeah, the image. And like, I was thinking, do you know Barbara Kruger, like the feminist artist? She's got black and white photographs with like red and white text across. And I wanted sort of like the body under erasure, but I was pumped that Oxford went for it.
Yeah. Let me see if I can make this work a little bit bigger because it's hard to see. Okay. I don't know if that's any bigger here or not. That is nice that they listened, that they appreciated your input. Actually, listen to it. So this wasn't your dissertation,
no.
But it's was your dissertation published?
That's Are We Not Men?
Yeah. Okay. I guess I would prefer to talk about this one first, if that's okay.
Oh, that's great.
Okay, yeah. So I tried to do a quick little blurb on Texts of Terror. Phyllis Tribble, I know you heard it. I've used her chapter on Judges 19, many times in classes. But of course, there's a chapter on Hagar as well, and I don't even remember all the different stories in there. To be honest, is Dinah address maybe?
No, it's Hagar, Tamar, Judges 19, like the Levite's concubine, and then Jephthah's daughter. So it's actually only 4 chapters. Just so interesting because it has it's so important, but it's a little book. It is a brilliant little book.
It is very small. Yeah. Okay, so. So you did share a little bit about, like, in graduate school, some experiences, observations, things for you around the issue of violence, physical violence, and I know I explained or you and I were chatting about it, but I don't like using the 2 words together, sexual assault. So some form of physical violence related to genitalia or intimate body parts. Why did you decide to take up and run with, right, the Texts of Terror and doing what you did with it? What's going on?
Yeah. So first I want to say Tribble's book, Texts of Terror, for me was really important and really influential, just like it was, it sounds like, for you. I mean, it's such a really important book in biblical studies, and it's such an important, like, launching of feminist biblical. Like, there are other feminist foremothers that we should also think about. I mean, somebody like Carole M's work, I think, is so important too.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah, like Tribble, it's a great book. But I also started to get frustrated about the way that if you would sometimes have, like, a grad class, there'd be like 1 week on feminism, you'd like read Tribble, and then you'd be like, and we're done with feminism. It felt like it was doing this work where people weren't even reading it. They would just cite the phrase and then footnote Tribble. And it felt like, so that was one problem I had. A second problem
That's still happening even when you were in graduate school?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. Totally. Same thing. And I would see it at our conference. And so there was that. Wow. And then there's also the way that Tribble talks about, like, our job as feminist readers is to bear witness to bad things that happen, which is so powerful. She has this page where she has pictures of tombstones of the 4 women she talks about. But, like, one thing is that 2 of those women are not dead. And I got really interested and kind of obsessed with the way that this work of remembering women who've been victims of violence as women who are dead, like the collapsing of that category, like Hagar is not dead. Tamar is not dead. And that seems important to me. That's different from, like, Jephthah's daughter who's dead, or the Levite's concubine. So I wanted to think about sort of what else feminist criticism could do with those terrible, like, we call them texts of terror, right? These terrible stories. Right. And then also I was teaching undergraduates, the conversation about campus sexual violence was taking off, right? Okay. The Me Too movement. And I felt like a lot of the scholarship on these topics it just wasn't written in a way that was connecting with my students' experiences on campus. It wasn't connecting with the way that my friends and I were talking about the issue. Like, it just, often it would be like, there would be these well-intentioned older scholars. This is not Tribble, but just like there would be scholars to be like, can you imagine a worse thing than a woman who was raped? Could you imagine, like, truly? And like, you know, that every class you teach, there are survivors in the class.
Exactly.
And it felt so icky to be teaching that. And so I wanted to kind of think more about it. And that all kind of led me to this project. I was working on a whole book about like women in it was way too broad. And I was like, no, I just need to focus this in.
Okay. So yes, that is... So one of the things that you talk about in this book is this issue of the way people want to talk about consent, non-consent, this kind of binary or this very clear delineation, I guess. What is it that you'd like us to reconsider about that?
So this is the conversation I was talking about. Part of what was going on at this time was there was this real push for, like, if students just know about consent, then we can fix sexual cultures on campus, right? So I want to say really clearly, really explicitly, we should have consent. Consent is something that is necessary. It is also not on its own sufficient to create a just and equitable sexual economy. So I absolutely support consent.
Yes.
Especially I think consent is a good way to deal with relationships like among people in the real world. Applying consent to biblical texts, I don't think is a very good interpretive model. And I also got really interested in reading, especially like feminist and queer critiques of consent. And so one thing that a lot of...
Okay, hold on. Sorry, I'm going to ask you to back up and slow down just a little bit, because this is getting really fun and interesting. Not that the earlier wasn't. Please don't misunderstand me. Can we say that again just a little bit slower? So you're talking about...
So consent, good in the real world.
Yeah, you got that, right?
Particularly good applied to biblical texts.
Right, okay.
And also in the real world, there are some interesting and smart people coming from politically feminist and queer places that are saying, hey, like relying on just consent is actually can be kind of a problem.
Okay.
And so they're making that argument from, and I would just say the book that is really great on this is by Joseph Fischel, and it's called Screw Consent. And it's about,
that's awesome.
And he says, consent, he says consent's not bad, but like we need other ways to sort of think about consent. And so like one thing about consent is that it assumes that you always know what you want. Another thing about consent is that it assumes that you kind of like, you have this stability as a person. So like there are lots of interesting thinking about, can people who have mental disabilities consent? Can people with like Alzheimer's? There are all these kind of interesting kind of court cases and sort of like negotiating, like, is yourself, like, who is the you who consents to what when? Another thing about consent is that often it's something that more powerful people extract from less powerful people.
Yes.
And so, and I think this is really important. Like, it's not actually about equality. It's often something that, and so like, there's been some good studies of like pharmaceutical trials, for example, in the two-thirds world talking about, people consent to these, but like.
Oh yeah. But can we talk about why they have signed up, right? How much are you paying them?
Yeah. And so like, this is a big problem. Like what, and then there's the question of like, why do people consent to things that aren't in their own self-interest?
Right.
And so this is something that there's an interesting book called Just Sex. Is it called Just Sex? Yeah, by Nicola Gavi. And she talks about, she's a psychologist. Okay. And she talks about women who have told her about consenting to sex because if I didn't consent, he would have raped me.
Yes.
And she's like, she has that response where she's like, this is awful. But then do I tell the person? Like, it's this interesting, very icky and uncomfortable gray area. But it's, and another, I'll just give you one more kind of sketchy example. I was working on this project and I was rereading The Handmaid's Tale. And, we think about The Handmaid's Tale, we use it as shorthand for reproductive freedom, for women losing their rights. We think of Offred as a rape victim, all the handmaids as being raped. But explicitly in the text, Offred says, she's describing what's happening. She says, it wasn't rape. And so then I was like, oh, but it feels like rape to me. But then I'm like, oh, am I telling someone, disavowing their own ability to narrate their experience? It was just really, it threw me off I was teaching it and I was like, but I thought Offred was raped, but Offred says on page 46 or whatever, she wasn't raped. So there's all this kind of rich complication. And so I think that consent alone is not enough, and we need other kind of tools. And so one of the tools that I talk about in my book is I talk about how we need other categories or other language to talk about sexual violence. And so I talk about how often it's fuzzy, it's often messy, and it's often icky. And I use this kind of like everyday language to sort of talk beyond a sort of just like, oh, like, let's do a consent test. Oh, it passed. Great. Like, for a while, they were trying to pass off these consent apps where, like, if you were going to have sex with someone, they would consent on, you would record them consenting. And then if it went to court, you could be like, oh, no, but they consented, which is just like awful. And like, fortunately, it seems like the culture went a different way. But...
Totally. Oh, my gosh. And I need a minute to process that.
Yeah. And I was on this committee and somebody was like, this would be great. We could solve campus sexual violence. And we just bought this app for students or whatever. And like,
are you kidding me? An educated person on
and it's these people who everyone wants to reduce violence, but it's just we all know our experiences are ickier and messier than that.
Right.
And so
it's so much messier.
And the Bible is too, I think.
And the Bible is too, because we don't, aside from like any historicity issues, right? Just set that all aside, right? What do we know? What do we know about anyone's willingness or interest or what they've been trained or taught to put up with, and therefore find normal, even if it is back to your point about going along with things that aren't in their best interest, but that's really what options that they have, and how, so you're inviting us to think a little bit more messily about
absolutely.
this kind of yes or no, all the different power dynamics that are at work. The power differentials are pervasive, right? In every single relationship that we can that we see in, talked about, narrated in the Bible. We have power differentials. That's a big piece of, right, patriarchal relationships, patriarchally defined relationships, I guess. So very interesting. Yeah. And as I was listening to you talk about this, I sometimes do these little shorter videos. I have a series called Does the Bible Tell You So?
Mm-hmm.
And someone asked me to do one on consent in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you would approve of the video, and it's okay if you don't. But I basically said, no, there's none in there. So let's just
it's not a useful, it'd be great, but it's not a good interpretive tool. And there's a lot of messiness in our experience. Like another thing I talk about in my book is unhappy reading. Like I would love there to be consent in the Bible, and there isn't. And I feel unhappy about that, but also that can be like holding space for that kind of being unhappy is also, I think, an important response to allow ourselves and to name and think about. I mean, when I read the Levite's concubine, like I'm not happy.
Right.
And I think that's important.
I do too. It needs to be allowed. We need to normalize just whatever our reactions are, instead of finding ways to tolerate it or excuse it away. Yeah. What else would you like to tell us about this book of yours, this second book of soul?
That's a good question. I mean, the two big things I think are the fuzzy, messy. I can tell you a little bit more about fuzzy, messy, icky. So I use these terms as sort of a framework. And I talk about how sexual violence is fuzzy because sometimes we don't remember things, or sometimes our experiences don't really gel until we told someone else about them. And like in the Bible, like you could think about a story like Dinah, which we think of, or Dinah in Genesis 34. Like we think of it as a story about rape, but there's also a tradition of reading it as a love story. And it's almost, it's like Footloose, or like he's the boy from like the sweet Canaanite. And that my students especially are like, that's disgusting, it's awful. But like the text, both of those readings you can support with the text.
You really can.
It feels fuzzy, and that is important.
It is.
And then I talk about messy. So a lot of these stories are messy. The interpretation spins out. We often, like I talk about this as a story of Tamar. And so it's a story about, like, that one's pretty clearly about
We're
rape.
Talking about Amnon.
Good question. Yeah, Amnon and Tamar in 2 Samuel 13. But then like it becomes this whole sort of story about the David story. So I want to think about the way, like, rarely a story of sexual violence in the real world or in the text is just limited to one kind of moment where we can clearly say everything and resolve it and put it in a nice little box. And we really want to box things up, and that is not actually a good interpretive tendency. And then I think a lot of the stories are icky. I think a lot of our experiences are icky. Like sometimes something will happen and maybe it doesn't rise to the level. Maybe you don't want to label it a certain thing, but there's a way that we feel, a way our experience, the way we can feel. So it's also a way I could tell you that somebody's creepy. And it's a way of communicating a lot without also actually saying anything. And I think icky, a lot of biblical stories to me feel icky. So something like, the story in Ezekiel 16, that feels icky.
Oh, like, gosh, yes.
About, like Lot and his daughters. Does Lot rape his daughters? Do his daughters rape Lot? I mean, one thing is like, I remember like walking in to teach it when I first started teaching and being like, oh, I feel icky. They feel icky. There's this way that like when we talk about the story together, it's sort of like everybody's just like, oh, together. And so I wanted to also name that as part of our response. And so that's the sort of like, this is a framework I give, and I talk about it with specific stories of sexual violence, but I think it applies to other forms of violence. I'm thinking about maybe if it applies more broadly. I just want to give us more ways to think about tricky texts, really.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so funny because, as I listen to you talk, I'm like, well, duh, not, it's like, well, duh, like, why isn't that more normal that we, for people to talk about? That's an icky text. That's a story that doesn't end well. That's a story that doesn't wrap up, right? Or it throws some, the focus of David's story is really interesting. It's not as focused anymore. We have these very interesting dynamics that he is just leaving out there. Like, doesn't say anything to anyone.
Are just so like messy and open. And that's also, if it's a bad thing happens, but we learn a good lesson, that can be sort of sad. Or, like it's like The Notebook, like you can have a good cry or whatever. But our biblical stories don't always do this. They just kind of like leave you. And that is also like unhappy for you as a reader because you don't get your good catharsis and you don't get your moral. And I think that's important.
I'm trying to figure out how I can bring this to my students. I teach online at this point, and so many, the students who want to come in and talk about that the Bible's good for morals and all these things. I'm like, let's see.
It's tricky, and I don't want to say it's not all bad either. But I think it's just for me, it's. And this is sort of part of my larger framework too. I think we want to resist having just like a master theory that explains everything. Like it's tempting. But then you start to, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Sort of like being, so there's a scholar, Eve Sedgwick, who talks about paranoid reading, right? Which is like a reading that has a master structure like paranoia, and that it can explain everything. And I think that that's so tempting, but like if we resist that and just kind of like figure out what we can do with each little story, that can be helpful. I mean, it's also not as like, you can't just like have a master theory that you drop on your grandmother at dinner or something. Like it's harder as a student. It doesn't give you a big framework for everything, but I think it's important as readers.
Yeah. Well, and as the texts themselves are varied, right, in terms of what genre and their intention and their purpose at the time, right? So that kind of opens up that conversation for people too, who might not be used to thinking about it more complexly. At least the background I come from, where people just think of it as it's all very good, and we just read it and it's self-explanatory and God said it, I believe it, and all that kind of, this is a nice...
and that's that like temptation of innocence we were talking about before too. Like you want the text to be innocent. You don't want bad stuff in your Bible. Right? You want your Bible to be good and clean. And that's right. I mean, we know Thomas Jefferson like cut up his Bible and took out all the bad parts, but
not much left.
There wasn't a lot left, but like I want to think about the text in all its messiness.
Yeah. Nice. Thank you for that. Thank you for the work in doing that. You. Yeah. I don't have you don't have the book yet, but what you're working on now, I love it. You are currently, you said you're working on a project with someone on the horror stuff, but also every time I read something in the Hebrew Bible, it talks about women and land and women. And I just kind of have something spins around in my head and I just want to scream and, and like, it's so prevalent. What is there something you can tell us about why you're choosing to work on that next?
So in this Text After Terror book, I'm like touching it because I have it.
Yes,
it's in paperback
do.
now.
Please do. Yeah.
So look, it's like fairly cheap even.
Oh, that's right. I saw that post.
I was excited that it's in paperback. Yes. So in that book, I mostly talk about stories that are about female characters that are like human women. The one exception is I talk about Daughter Zion, who is this sort of metaphorical version of Judah or Jerusalem in the Book of Lamentations. And I talk specifically about her in Lamentations and how she's not good at being a survivor because she doesn't do what we want survivors to do. And I talk about that with some like queer and feminist like work on the experience of being a survivor. So I want to think more about metaphorical female representations in the text. Yeah. And so I'm working on, but also I wanted to think about something that wasn't just about sexual violence, although the woman as land does get also kind of icky.
It really does, yeah.
So like there's this metaphor where often the land is represented as like a woman and the woman is like a land. So you want to conquer the land. It's like raping a woman, right? The land is available to be plowed. You've got all of this kind of sexualization. There's a related metaphor where the woman's body is like a garden. So you see that like in Song of Songs, but other places in the garden, it's full of like delicious fruit you want to eat. It's like, Song of, it's pretty hard to not make Song of Songs sexual, though I have students who've done it, which I'm impressed by. And then, so you have Daughter Zion, you have some other kind of female metaphors. So in this book that I'm working on now, right now I'm calling it This Is Not My Beautiful Body, but I don't know if that'll stick.
Okay.
Each of the chapters, I talk about a metaphor of the female body and I pair it with contemporary fiction, mostly queer and feminist short stories. And so, for example, like The Woman is Land, I talk about in the Bible, you have this metaphor that a woman's body is like the land and the land is like a woman. And I talk about it with two short stories, one of which is about a woman who turns into a planet, like literally. It's called The Woman Who Thought She Was a Planet. And one of them is about a woman that it's about a character who transitions between gender several times and then eventually turns into a rock and then the moon.
Oh, cool.
And so I want to sort of think about ways that fiction can give us resources to think about these metaphors as something other than the sort of like way they're traditionally used, which is that we understand them as texts that hurt us or texts that do harm. And so like, I think most readers now are not like celebrating the land being colonized, being raped, but like we spend a lot of energy talking about the toxic dimension of the metaphor. But I want to think if we can think about the metaphors in other kinds of ways. And so that's why I'm bringing fiction to think about it. It's still kind of in a messy phase, as you can tell when I describe it, but
yeah, no, it's okay.
I kind of want to rethink the metaphors.
Okay. And do you think you can give us something positive in what is in the biblical text?
I think I want to just find more space around them. So I want to say that they're not only negative metaphors, but I also want to I want to say also, so like the land is like a woman's body, we need to conquer it. Like obviously that metaphor has done a lot of very real damage over like if you think about like the history of colonization, right? You think about like the doctrine of discovery, all kinds of things. And so I don't want to deny that harm, but I want to think if there are ways besides harm we can think about these metaphors. I realize that's really abstract, and it's probably because I have lots of notes and bits of chapters, but I don't really have like a full anything yet. So
that's okay. Yeah. You're working on it as you're able to, right? We did have a question come in for you, and this is actually a good point to kind of pause and ask you all if you do have questions for Rhiannon. This would be the time to throw it in. I didn't see any that came through earlier, but there may have been some. So I think that it was mostly just a fun little chatter today. So yes, if you have questions, I question everything. Yes, you do, Carrie Ann, and I love that you do. So here's a question for you, Rhiannon. Interesting, given it has not really related to what you're talking about and the work that you do. So you can respond to this however you feel like it. Thank you, DeFreak, for the $2 super chat. And I guess I should leave it up here.
Yeah. So the question is, what do I say about Jesus Christ? I don't know if this is like, I missed a lot of the chat. If this is like a theological. So I'm a scholar of the Hebrew Bible. So I would say like, this sounds like an out, but really like, I don't see Jesus Christ in a Christian. So Christians will find Jesus Christ in the Hebrew Bible. And there are long Christian histories of interpreting text. I don't, in my work, read the Bible, the Hebrew Bible. I don't read those stories as being about Jesus Christ. I feel like there's maybe an edge to this question. And so I have found feminist theology really helpful in my own kind of theological journey, right? I'm a Christian. I think feminist theology is great. I love queer theology. I mean, somebody like our Marcella Althus Reed, I think is fantastic, but I will say that once I was talking about my first book, which is about masculinity in the Bible and the prophets in particular, and someone asked me where the loving God of the New Testament is in the book of Hosea. And I don't really think that God in Hosea, like the character of God, is a loving character. Like I think that is an abusive figure. And so I think for me, Christianity is not something that is all about a kind of like literal reading of the text. Like that's not my faith conviction. I think that can be a very harmful way to think about it. And so for me, just like the historical reality of the composition of the text isn't a theological problem. This also isn't a problem. But yeah, I would say that's what I would say.
Thank you. That was more than I had expected. That was a very generous response. Yeah, right. What? I'm trying to think if there's a follow-up on that, but thank you for entertaining the question. And does anyone else have a question, a comment, anything for, I don't know if you have a chance to look at the questions or comments, Rianne, and the last, Carrie Ann Chrysler is often here in the chats, and I think she's a fan of the work you do and what you've been saying. So what else can this has been just really rich, this getting to tap into your brain a little bit, to get to hear a little bit about the way you think about engaging biblical texts and what's at stake for you, the kinds of conversations you're raising. I'm also really intrigued because you don't have a harsh edge to you. You're just kind of doing the thing, right? And I find that just really refreshing,
Oh, thanks.
I think I feel like I have a lot of anger that I have to try to weed out when I do something that can be in order for it to be helpful or productive. And I don't get the sense that you've had to deal with that maybe as much.
That's interesting. I mean, I think we all feel anger. There's frustration, there's anger, but one thing I will say is it's been so helpful to me to find other just colleagues who are doing interesting things. And I feel like one thing that I have been able to do more as a scholar as I've gotten older is sort of find what I want to actually think about and what I want to work on. And so, I also want to name that there have been a lot of people who've been really generous. So like, we didn't really talk about it. I also wrote a commentary on Jonah.
Oh, right. Yes.
It's like a very much more traditional work of scholarship, but the two colleagues I work with, Steve McKenzie and John Kaltner, they're just like the most kind, lovely collaborators. And I think having collaborations like that really just like restore your faith in working with other people. I mean, I think also, I love the Bible. People think I don't like it because I write some critical things, but I love wrestling with it. I mean, Tribble talks about, she's talking about the story of Jacob and the angel, or Jacob wrestling God. And she says, you have to wrestle with the text until it blesses you. And right, like Jacob gets wounded, but he keeps wrestling. And Tony Kushner talks about this. I was just teaching Angels in America, like that's a big part. So I feel like it's like, we're all wrestling with the text, and that, I find a lot of pleasure in that. I mean, everyone gets frustrated, but I love the Bible. I love reading the Bible. Somebody asked I saw about future projects. I'm working on this Weird Bodies book. If you read any weird short fiction that sounds appropriate, send it to me, please. But I'm also, what else am I working on? I really like the fiction writer Joy Williams. I'm working on a project about Joy Williams in the Bible, really early stages. I'm working on this feminist horror manifesto. I've got a couple other. I don't know. I've just looking forward to sort of having some time to think. It's the very end of the semester. So like in the semester, your thoughts are all kind of squished.
Yes, they are.
Just need a little time.
I do have a couple here that I want to throw up here on the screen. What is the I think April Van Ryn, what is a queer interpretation of the anti-gay rhetoric in the Old Testament?
Oh man. Well, I feel
That's
like
big.
You're on Jennifer's channel, and first you should watch you probably have watched all her videos, but like that would be where I would send someone. So I think the short answer, I'm not saying that the Bible is like, there are lots of things that are icky in the text or terrible. And I think that there are parts of the text that it feels like are pretty homophobic. I think that there also are a lot of spaces of queer possibilities. Like I teach a class called, in this spring I taught Sex in the Hebrew Bible. I teach a queer Bible class. And so what we do in queer Bible is like, we look at all the icky stuff in Leviticus and we kind of deal with it. And then we look at spaces of queer possibility. So I would say one thing.
Nice.
It's not so clear what it means in Leviticus. It feels like it's probably about men having sex with men, but it's not maybe so straightforward. There's a great article called "Who is Doing What to Whom?"
Yes,
I love that.
Yeah,
and he's like gives us 21 possible interpretations, and your takeaway is like, what does this mean?
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, it's easy to go to like David and Jonathan or Ruth and Naomi. Those both have a lot of lovely kind of queer scholarship. There's some interesting work on queering God's relationship to Israel. So I think there is as much room or more room for queer space as feminist space. It feels to me like there's more consistently a patriarchal bias in the text, and yet we still found so many great feminist ways to read it. And I think that's available for queer reading also. I mean, I love our colleague Ken Stone's work. I think, but if you want like a good starting point, I think Take Back the Word is still like really holds up as a collection. It's a collection of essays by Robert Goss and Mona West. It's funny you asked this question because my laptop is too low, so it's propped up on the Queer Bible Commentary.
Awesome.
It's so thick it can get my laptop to up. So like also there is a lot of work.
There is a lot of work. Yes. We had another super chat. Thank you, Jesse Jane, 77 Jesse Jane 77. With Simone de Beauvoir's Anthropology, what do you think about how Israel culture changed sex roles compared to paganism, sex morals, etc.?
Oh, okay. So first I want to say it's been a while since I read de Beauvoir, so I don't want to if I misrepresent her, that is on me. It is not on her. Her work is complicated and interesting, and also like just such a pleasure to read. I should probably go back and reread it. So thank you for reminding me that I should do that on the summer. So I think it seems to me like maybe part of this question is, are the Israelites different? And that can go two ways. And I'm not sure which way you're thinking. And so I maybe want to name them both. So one way is that there is one tendency to interpret, which is like, the Israelites will talk about the Canaanites and the people around them as being sexual perverts. And they'll often be like, like there's a famous article by our colleague Randall Bailey they're nothing but incestuous bastards, because most, like, there are all these origin stories for non-Israelites that are usually incest, and like Lot's daughters are the ancestors of the Moabites. So one way of thinking is like Israelites had good proper sex, the Canaanites were weird pervs. And this is something that some like 19th, 20th, some older scholarship got really into this idea that like Canaanites had creepy sex cults. There's not really any evidence of that. It's just like we like to imagine people near us who are different from us as being weirdos. And so I would say that historically there isn't a big difference there. The other part, and I'm not sure if this is what you're thinking, is the sort of like goddess culture. I mean, my name is Rhiannon, which is like from the goddess moment of the 80s. This sort of idea that like there was a goddess culture and this was matriarchal and egalitarian, and then like the Judeo-Christian, or like, which is itself like an essentializing, but like biblical culture like brought in patriarchy. I think that also, I wish, like, it's so fun to think about. There also isn't really support for that. Like, we didn't have this like beautiful matriarchy that got lost. Or we don't have the evidence that we want for it. I wish that we did. I mean, I love a good like 80s goddess novel about that too. But so I think I would say that generally the Israelites were fairly similar to their neighbors, probably more similar than they want. And that often the way that we talk about sex, like in our sex laws, is really about a kind of idealized identity definition, not necessarily what people are doing. Like one thing we talk about in my class a lot is, did the people follow their, like, what were people actually doing? Were they following these laws? And I think that that's right. So I'm a biblical scholar. I deal with the text, not so much with material culture, but there's also like, there's a gap there. So I don't know if that got at your question at all, but those are two, I would just say, I would be against like sexual exceptionalism, I think.
Yeah, that's a nice way to summarize it. Thank you. That's a lovely response. Since there aren't any other questions coming in, I think that'll do it. I feel like there was something else that came up as you were answering, but I think that's a good place to leave it. We'll wrap it up with this. Is there actually since we do have a couple minutes, are you okay to go a couple minutes longer?
Yeah.
I didn't ask you about your dissertation, and I'm drawing a blank on the.
Oh, Are We Not Men?
Are We Not Men? Unstable Masculinity in the Hebrew Prophets. Is there a short version or a kind of a? I'm curious how you came on that topic. Like as a feminist biblical scholar and as a obviously a woman who's very interested in literature and writing and all those things, but that you chose a topic related to men specifically. It's kind of fun and interesting to me. So
yeah. And I thought starting this project that like thinking about gender was a feminist project, thinking about our gendered bodies. And so I thought it was feminist to think about masculinity. And then it turned out like the field of masculinity studies is somewhat feminist, but also often really not feminist. So I sort of just like stumbled and I was like, oh, where have I ended up? But I wanted to think about masculinity. And this is where like Ira Gray was useful for me. She talks about how the masculine passes as unmarked and the feminine is marked. So like thinking about like there's t-shirts and then there's women's t-shirts if you're ordering like for a group.
Yes.
And so I wanted to mark the masculine and think about that. And it was also really okay. So that was like part of it.
Okay.
I was interested in just all the weird stuff that happens to prophets in their bodies. So like Ezekiel tying himself up, Ezekiel like prophesying like Hosea's marriage is weird. Jeremiah has like constantly complaining. Moses has his stutter and his limp. Like their bodies are just strange. And so what I wanted to think about was like what masculinity, how to be a man, what it means to be a man in a body. What is it being a prophet do to your masculinity? And so basically I argue that prophecy, the masculinity of the prophet is queered by the call to prophecy. And so being a prophet makes your masculinity it's unstable and it's not normative and it looks kind of queer. And so that's what I talk about in that book basically throughout.
I like it.
Prophet I have with a contemporary text, they sort of pair them, but that's the basic kind of argument.
Okay. Nice.
I mean, the other thing is it's terrible to be a prophet. Like that.
Right.
It's not
I know. Yeah. Whether or not it's doing anything queer to your body. It's just bad in and of itself. It's a hard calling. Thank you, Scott. I appreciate your support very much. Okay. And there's one interesting follow-up from him. So let's do this. Can you comment on the best way to help those committed to reading the Hebrew Bible as nice? Best way to help those who are committed to that. I think your comment about holding them to a standard of reading the Bible literally is helpful.
Yeah. So, and I want to think about what maybe like talk out loud about what you mean by helping them read. So my general sense is that you want to help people have a deeper, richer way of reading, and not just sort of be like, it's nice or nothing else.
I think I know him enough to know that's what he's
getting at. And so I think and that's great, because if you come at someone like, I want to take away your faith, the Bible sucks, like this is terrible, like that just to me feels, that's cruel.
It is cruel. I agree. Yeah, that's not helpful.
And so I would say, the first thing I would say is that I find in teaching, looking at really small text slowly is the most useful thing. So just like, it's easy to say the Bible says X, but then when you really zero down and just look at one story and just force yourself to stay with it, I think that is really helpful.
Last part's really key, by the way.
Yeah,
right?
Just lingering.
Nope, you don't get to move on. You don't get to deflect to another later story. Yeah. You're just going to stay with this one.
And so I think that is the biggest thing. In my book, I talk about 4 kind of strategies. So I talk about this, we brought this up before, the innocence issue. So basically just like, we don't think texts are innocent. We come to text from places. We're not expecting the Bible. We're just sort of bracketing our assumptions. And I talk about not trying to have a major overarching theory. And I talk about paying attention to how we feel when we're reading text. And I think for me, reading with literature is helpful. So like, I'll give you 2 concrete strategies. In class and in just generally talking about the Bible, I often find like reading the biblical text slowly and then bringing in like a contemporary poem about it, like that kind of space of encounter can help sort of like shake loose what we see in the text. The other thing, this goes back to like when I was teaching freshman composition, like everyone does in grad school, there's this great 5 analytic moves in reading a text where first you suspend judgment and then you find the significant part. It's from a book called Writing Analytically. And then you find like what the significant parts of what you're reading are. And then you make the implicit explicit. And then you look for patterns, and then you start over and you do it again. And just like doing that, like suspending judgment, finding the important parts, making the implicit explicit, looking for pattern, like doing that sort of opens up the text for you. I mean, I think also like it's a process. It's hard to read the text, and it takes generosity and time for it to happen. Sometimes I think also strategically, like if you're dealing with someone who has a very strong, like it's easier to start with a text that's less emotionally charged. So it's harder to do this with like the Gospels or like Genesis 1. It's maybe easier, to do it with like something weird in Judges or like with Ruth, or like if you start at the kind of edges of the text, it's sometimes emotionally a little bit easier.
Yes. This is great advice. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, this is lovely. Okay. We're going to call it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you. And thank you everyone who's here and chatting with each other and engaging Rhiannon while she was here. And I'm gonna drop you out here for just a second, and then hang tight. We'll chat later. Thank you all for being here. Those of you who were able to and wanted to be here live, those of you who are watching it later. I think you all know that it's helpful for me and helpful for other people. If you found this a useful or interesting video, to like it and to subscribe to my channel. It helps other people who are also interested in this kind of conversation to find my work. And that just helps everybody when you do that. So I appreciate all the ways that you do that kind of thing, supporting me. I'm grateful to the people who support me through Patreon. I have started doing a live conversation with people who support me that way. And it's the 3rd Thursday of the month. And so it's a couple weeks. Anyway, that's a really fun, just an hour to talk with people and raise questions and talk about whatever it is you want to talk about. So that's been a fun thing to do as well. And that's it. It'll be back to me next week. Haven't figured out what the I might do the suffering servant in Isaiah, because someone just asked about that. So we'll see. So I will see you all next week.